welcome back to another session. In this one, we'll be discussing about destructuring in JavaScript ES6. So in the previous session, we saw in the very end a little bit, or let's say the introduction of what Java destructuring is. And in this particular session, we'll see that how destructuring works, its different forms and its different variations in play, and the different scenarios in which this destructuring can be a lot helpful to us as developers while we are working with our code. And mind you, the concept of destructuring is not something without which the code will not work. It is sort of a technique or a concept using which you can further make your code much more readable, and that will help to even sometimes let's say reduce the overall complexity of the code. So let's directly see what we have inside our sandbox. I hope you can see my screen now. So the initial sandbox that we have, we don't have much files inside this. I mean, the style index.html and styles.css is similar to the previous, like the way we always have them. We have one special file in this one, that is info.js, and we have an index.js that is completely empty. So since we are looking at the, let's say, a concept of a JavaScript and not React in this particular case, because the destructuring is a foundational or a core concept of JavaScript, which we further use inside our React code in order to make our lives easier. So what do we have here is, first of all, we have a file called info.js, and we have an array called trees. All right. So first we have an array called trees. Let's try to break it down one by one. Let's call this array trees, and first what we should do is, let's export this first. Export default trees. Whoops. Now what we do is we import this from its location, which is info, and let's try to console log this. And if we look inside our console, you can see that trees is actually an array which is denoted by these box type braces, and inside that we have two objects. All right, so this is an array of objects, and its name is trees. So we have just simply two objects inside this with two key value pairs. Name equals to mango, and taste, that is sweet. In the second one, we are considering the tree of coconut, and its taste is salty. So actually it's I don't know whether salty is the correct word, but let's say just use it. We'll just be using one of these objects in order to demonstrate whatever functionalities we are trying to use in this particular one. So what we saw in the previous lecture was that we can take out these elements. Let's not call them objects as of now. We said that if we have an array, for example, so first we are discussing about array destructuring. Okay, inside array destructuring, we said that if we have n number of elements, in this case we have two of them. So what we can do is, we can, let's say, create another array in which we can explicitly mention some variables, and how many variables? N variables for an n sized array. So in this case, let's call our first variable mango and the second variable as cocoa, and we make it equal to trees like this. And after doing that, if now I try to console log mango and we head over to our console, you can see that the first element, which was this object, now gets stored inside a variable called mango, and if we console log it, we can see it simply represents that object in which we have two key value pairs. The first one is name with this name, and second is taste with this one. If you use this sort of method, for example this way, that will also work totally fine, because this also implements that you are taking a variable, and this particular variable is storing the first element. Since array starts with the index of 0, the first element of this array, okay, which is this object in this case. But point number one to note inside array destructuring is, if you see, as soon as I let's say uncomment this out, so let's see, yeah, if we do something like this, so you see, if now I create this mango variable for the second time, so the error that we get is that mango has already been declared. Since you know that initially when I was creating this as a var, so it was just updating the value of trees. So as a standard coding practice, the first principle that you should always remember is, number one thing, that the variables that you know are going to initialize once and they do not require to be edited again or to be modified again, you should always put them as a const. I sometimes tend to forget it while explaining concepts to you. For example, in this case, previously I took it as a variable, but because we are just taking the object out of this trees, and whatever operations we will do, we will further do it on that object and not on the name itself. So we should always consider to use them as constant. And the second thing is that whatever name that you are using for your constant, or let's say even in variables, you should always make sure that it is unique. For example, if you have declared a variable called mango here, and somewhere down the line you are not supposed to use another variable with the same name, because that creates confusion. So that was one thing to remember. Always ensure that these variables, in this case which is constant, always try to have unique names in this. Now this was the destructuring that we saw in array. Okay, let's say now I comment this out. The second thing is, what about destructuring in an object? So we know that these two things that we have, these mango and cocoa, these both are objects. So let's try applying destructuring in objects. Since this was an array, in order to destructure it, we use these braces. But if we are talking about objects, we are supposed to use curly braces. Now, inside mango, we said we had two entries. So let's take it like this. And if I put this equal to mango, and let's say if I log this, taste like this. So you can see I'm getting sweet here. Because, okay, let's not go again and again here. I think it will be better to just put it like this, and I'm just commenting this out. Yeah, so you can see the taste that we had in this case was sweet, so it is getting console logged here. So whenever we are destructuring an object, we are always supposed to wrap these inside curly braces. Now, what is another difference between destructuring an object and destructuring an array? The first difference was these braces. The second difference is that if you are destructuring an array, you can name your variables whatever you want. What I mean by this is, even if you name this F1 for fruit 1, let's say, and F2 in this case, and then if you console log F1, let's say, it will work just fine. You can see the first object is now getting logged here. And let's say we rename this as F1 as well. But in the case of objects, the name of these variables that you take, you cannot use them by your own will. Whatever keys that you have inside this object, these two parameters we had, and we had two key value pairs of name and taste. So the variables that you take while destructuring an object, it should be precisely the same as mentioned here. So for example, if I make it equal to not taste and let's say F2, and if I try to use F2 here, you will see that not F2, let's call this F3. So if we do this, you can see that we get an undefined here because it is not recognizing that which particular element we are actually referring to. So the first difference we saw between, let me roll it back. The first difference that we saw between destructuring and array is these brackets. The second one was the way we name our variables. In the case of array, we are free to use the names of our variables as we want, but in the case of objects, we are not free to use whatever name we want. We have to put the exact names that we have, like in this case. So that was the standard convention. But the question arises is that is there no possible way to change these particular variables or to rename them according to ourselves? So there is a method by which you can do something like this. Let's say you say, okay, I'm gonna call the name variable which will pick up whatever element we have in this particular object, and I'm gonna call it what should we call it? Let's say we call it nm. Okay, and for example, in the case of taste, we call it ts. So now if I try and console log ts, so now what it will do is it will check for the name key inside this mango object. I mean by mango we are referring to the first object inside this array of trees. So the first object, it is saying, okay, take out the key value pair with the key of name. We took this and rename this to nm, and same applies to taste as well. We are renaming this to ts. So now we can use this ts wherever we want without worrying what the initial property was named for our object. Now the cases where this is useful is, for example, you are dealing with some sort of public APIs where you are not responsible or you do not get to name these key value pairs firsthand. In that particular case, you can simply do it like this, and what it will do is it will first identify whatever element you are referring to via the original name and then assign that particular property or whatever content is inside that to this particular variable, which you can name whatever you want. The second thing, or the second feature that we can have in the case of objects, is something that can allow us to avoid inconsistencies. Now what I mean by this is, let's say I call it something like okay, let's use a little English here. Okay, I'm gonna create the name of arm and I'm just translating these two to the Hindi names. Okay, so the mango is arm and sweet is meetha. Now the second thing, what I mean by this is, if let's say in your original DB or the original array where this is mentioned, let's say if someone removed this, now in that particular case your code will not break and it will simply pick up this particular value that is mentioned by you explicitly. So what it means is, pick up the name from this particular object, the value that is being referred to by this particular key, pick that up and console log it. In case this particular property is not present in our object, then use this as its value instead. So if I put that back, you can see the name is again iterated back to its initial state. So this helps us to have, for example, a sort of a by default value for this particular variable of ours. So that's why this particular convention helps us to deal with stuff, or let's say to deal with inconsistencies, if any, in our code. So this was, all of these was regarding destructuring of objects. Now the next thing that we'll talk about is nested objects. And what do I mean by that is, so nested means something inside itself, alright, like two similar kind of stuff, one inside the other. So let's just say that we had these trees. Let's create another object. So I'm gonna call this object specs. And so this, we have inside this particular object, we have a key value pair in which this particular element, this property, is itself an object. And what this object consists of is, let's say we have size and we call it medium. So I'm basically referring to the height of these trees. So I'm saying, okay, the mango tree, the size of it is sort of medium, and the fruit color of this, which I'm simply referring to by fruit, let's call it yellow. Okay, just for demonstration purposes. So I know that sometimes mango is also green. So what we have now is this particular object that we have. This is a nested object because this is an object inside an object. Now how do we deal with these particular cases in which we have nested objects in front of us? Now in this particular case, what we can do is, the first thing that comes to mind is, if I again create the by the use of these curly braces, and instead of name I'm gonna call the another one taste, and the next one, let's say I call it specs, like this. So, and I make it equal to mango, like this. So what will happen is, if I try to log this specs inside this, what we see is, now we get hold, we mentioned these three elements from this particular object. And what is this referring to? This is referring to an object that consists of these two elements. First key value pair consists of size, that is medium, and second one is fruit, which is actually, okay, let me just call it fruit color, like this. Okay, so the second one is referring to the fruit color, which is yellow in this case. So if I want to get hold of any one property among these two, what I have to do is, I will be required to write something like this. Sorry, not this. It is an object, so using the dot operator. For example, if I am trying to get hold of the fruit color, so I will have to put the dot operator and write that particular property which I'm trying to access. So that is the basic method of writing whatever property we want to access inside an object. But is there a better way, or is there a way defined by destructuring itself, using which we can achieve this by simply writing whatever property we want to access, instead of writing the dot operator along with the object inside which this particular element is residing? Is there a way using which we can simply write this and retrieve its value? And the answer is yes. How do we do it? The way initially that you saw, in which by applying the colon we were able to rename this to any name that we wanted. What we can now do is, since this specs is itself an object, and the way we see in this particular case that we had to use the same names, whatever key value properties we had inside the object, similarly we can use, what did we use here, size and fruit color. So by simply mentioning them like this, what we now did is, we created two variables that refers to this particular object, and takes that, okay, search for this particular. Now let's again copy this and paste it here, and simply do it like this. See, I'm writing import in order to like put it inside, to enable a sort of a habit of importing components. All right, React is all about breaking stuff into components and then reintegrating them according to our need. So in this case, what we did was we initially wrote these three constants in which we mentioned specs. So since specs was a nested object, what we saw that if we directly console log this, we were getting an object. And now if we wanted to get hold of any property of this object, what we can do is we can further specify by using a colon and these curly braces and mentioning the names. Now again, these should also be similar to whatever you have defined right here. And then I can directly get hold of the value that is contained inside this key, inside this specs object, which is inside this object, which is the first element of array trees. So this was a way in which we were able to destructure not just one object, but a nested object as well. So I hope you were able to understand basically the destructuring of arrays and destructuring of trees. It is coming yellow. So let us just save these two like this. And then, yeah. So in this session, this was a small one, but I wanted to talk in depth about the destructuring that we saw for a very little part inside the previous session of ours. So what we saw was destructuring in arrays, destructuring in objects. How is destructuring in arrays different from that of in objects, and what to do if we get nested objects or something like that in our data, and how to rename the variables in the case of objects, because in arrays you can name them whatever you want. If you have the case of nested objects, how can we directly access the value associated with a particular key inside that nested object? So all of these were different scenarios that I could think of from a very beginner's point of view while studying destructuring. So what you can do is you can go ahead and use the sandbox link, try to mess around with it, and you can go through further by the official documentation in which this destructuring concepts is mentioned. You can get them on GFG or MDN docs, whatever you want. A simple Google search will do, and try to read through different examples, because like the way we saw some 5-6 examples, there are plenty of others in which they discuss different scenarios and different cases in which these functionalities or these concepts can be useful. Now in the upcoming session, we'll be having a little bit more difficult, let's say, implementation of these destructuring concepts, in which you will be required to use all this knowledge you gained with respect to destructuring arrays, destructuring objects, and destructuring nested objects, and how you can use them around in your React code, not just JavaScript code. So in the upcoming practice session, we'll be actually seeing the implementation of all of these. For that, I will see you there. And for this particular session, that's all from my side.